Standard just had rotation, the release of Edge of Eternities, a sweeping list of bannings, but it also might have a Vivi problem. A couple of months ago, I was at MagicCon Vegas, which happened right after the Final Fantasy set released, and I was walking around the event talking to players who were playing at the Pro Tour that was held at the event, and one thing I heard from pretty much every single pro player is that Vivi was absolutely busted. Sure, other cards like Corey Steelcutter and Monstrous Rage were busted too, but Vivi was the true power broker of Standard, lurking in the shadows of this incredibly busted format. If you've somehow been living under an Edge of Eternity space rock the last few months and missed Vivi Ornithir, is a 3-mana Izzet 0/3 legendary wizard that has a 0 ability that adds X mana of any combination of blue and or red, where X is Vivi's power. You can only activate it during your turn and only once each turn, and then whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on Vivi Ornithir, and it deals 1 damage to each opponent. Oh yeah, and if you need a Vivi, or any other cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. So just how dominant is this little 3-drop wizard? At Pro Tour Final Fantasy, 40% of players were playing Vivi in their decks, which was a huge number, and doubly so, considering pretty much all of these players were playing Vivi very wrong. While Brazilian pro and Hall of Famer Paulo Vitor Damarosa was preaching the power of Vivi with Agatha's Soul Cauldron in the Izzet Cauldron deck, even back then, before 7 cards were banned from Standard and rotation happened, just 3 players registered Izzet Cauldron at the event, while 127 played Vivi and Izzet Prowess. Of course, at the time this made some amount of sense, because Corey Steelcutter was still legal in the format, and Cutter was also an incredibly busted card. And the Izzet Cauldron decks couldn't really play Vivi and Cutter, you just got Vivi, while Izzet Prowess got to play both Vivi and Cutter, which led to an incredibly dominant deck. But with the benefit of hindsight, it seems like PvDDR might have actually, unsurprisingly, been right all along, and the best thing that you can do in Standard is play Vivi with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. While Arena Championships always have these weirdly inbred metagames because they're super small 40-ish player tournaments, this weekend was Arena Championship 9, and on day 1, 54% of the 37 players registered the Izzet Cauldron deck, and if you look at day 2, this rate increased to just under 69%, which isn't as nice as it might actually sound. By the time Arena Championship 9 actually concluded, 7 of the top 8 decks were Izzet Cauldron and all of the top 4. Well, these numbers are incredibly and scarily high. As I mentioned before, I typically don't worry too much about the meta at Arena Championships, just because they're so small and inbred that they don't usually mean a whole lot to the meta as a whole. While the deck's metagame percentage isn't overly concerning to me just because it's an Arena Championship, I will say that watching the deck repeatedly smack every other archetype on camera does make me a bit worried about its win rate. Well, the data from Magic Online challenges, the next most meaningful tournaments that we've actually had in Standard since rotation, aren't nearly as Vivi heavy as the Arena Championships. They're still a bit concerning. If we look at the last week of events, these are challenges held between August 2nd and August 9th. You'll see that at the beginning of the week, Izzet Cauldron was pretty fine, being in the 10 to 15% of the meta range, and not even being the most played deck at most of these events, with something like Dimir midrange or even Esper Self-Bounce having this honor. But by the end of the week, things had shifted, with Izzet Cauldron consistently taking up 30 to 35% of the meta, and if you just look at decks that performed well enough to make the top 8, the number increases even more. Over the 4 challenges held on August 8th and August 9th, there were a total of 32 decks that made the top 8, and 15 of these decks were Izzet Cauldron. And if you toss in the one Izzet Prowess deck that was playing Vivi fairly, Vivi decks took up a full half of the top 8 slots at these challenges, which is not exactly the numbers you want to be seeing just a week after Standard rotation. Of course, it's still super early in the meta, and I'm hoping that we'll see some evolution and changes as the weeks go by and we move towards the release of Spider-Man. There's a big open Spotlight Series event the last weekend of the month, which is going to provide data that's way more meaningful than the super inbred Arena Championship or Magic Online challenges. If if Vivi Cauldron is 50% of the meta there, then I'm really gonna start to worry. So how do we end up in a position where Vivi is so problematic? Well, first and foremost, the finger's gotta point back at Wizards, who actually designed the card. During a recent episode of Good Morning Magic, Gavin Verhey, one of Wizards' main designers, talked a bit about the design process of Vivi, and he mentioned that the first version of Vivi actually had to tap to make mana, and once you made mana with Vivi, you could only cast one more spell during the turn. But Wizards found this to be not that interesting or exciting.
Paul Diallo has a question about, basically, with Vivi, shouldn't have to remove counters for the mana. What's kind of the story behind this card? Let's see if I can find it or not. Boop. Here we are. Here's Vivi. Let me, I can kind of tell you the evolution of this card a little bit, how it got to this stage. So, it basically always had the non-creature spell, counter, and 1 damage ability. That was there since the beginning. It just made it so we loved it for Vivi, right? It was like, it's like the Black Mage thing, plus it's curious and he's growing bigger, right? But the first version of Vivi had a quite different ability. It was tap, add mana equal to Vivi's power, activate this ability, or so you can only cast 1 more spell this turn. That was the ability. So it started off as a tap ability. You only cast 1 more spell. I tried that for a little bit. It was not that like appealing or interesting.
So they went back to the drawing board. Their next change was to make it so Vivi would make mana at the beginning of combat, and then it would carry over for the rest of the turn, which actually would have been pretty interesting wording, because it would have meant that at least Vivi wouldn't work with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, because it would have been a triggered ability rather than a static ability, but they didn't like that version either.
And then I tried as, it fixes the digital issues if you try it as target player, so I tried as target player, but that read weird. Why are you targeting players with the ability? And it was, the ability was still not like Omega loved or whatever. And then we're like, okay, what if we just added mana at a specific time? And we debated timing for a while and we decided, let's try beginning of combat, and the mana like floats in your pool. So, the kind of thing where it like stays in your pool for the whole turn. And we tried at beginning of combat, but the timing was really weird because, you like often you want to cast your spells post-combat, you want to cast a combat trick inside of combat, or maybe you want to do something pre-combat with the mana. So that wasn't really the right timing.
So basically they just said, screw it, you can make mana with Vivi whenever you want, during your turn of course, however you want. And that's the version of Vivi that we ended up with.
So we're like, okay, what if you could just do it whenever you wanted, and just like you choose when the time window was on your turn? And that's where the 0 kind of came from, which is a very unique thing, but for a Mythic Rare, they could do unique stuff. And this card is like a really exciting Magic card. It lets you do a lot of powerful stuff, gives you a big dream to go after. Time will tell, if it is too strong, if it should have been like slightly weaker or something, but I think that if you try and just play it safe all the time, do exactly the obvious thing of like a tap ability or a of removing counters or whatever, that's not how you like push the envelope and get people to be like, wow, this card is super exciting. And I think this card is one of the most exciting cards in the set for a lot of people. So like I said, we'll see how it turns out.
In the video, Gavin even said that time will tell whether Vivi is too strong and should have been made weaker. Well, a month has gone by, and I think time is pretty clearly telling that the answer is yes. Wizards went a bit too far with Vivi. Basically, Wizards knew that printing Vivi in its existing form was a pretty risky card to make, but in their lust to make an exciting Magic card, they kind of disregarded the safety valves and printed Vivi in the most overpowered way possible. I think that Vivi also illuminates one of the problems with making Universes Beyond sets standard legal in an era when Commander is the main focus of the game. One of the goals of Vivi was to make it an exciting Commander, which I think Wizards clearly achieved, considering that on EDH Rec, Vivi is by far the most popular Commander from the Final Fantasy set, even though it's still $50 or $60 a copy, which is a lot to invest in your Commander, but we'll talk more about the price of Vivi in a few minutes. The problem I see here is the power level that would make Vivi an exciting card as a Commander isn't necessarily the same power level that would make Vivi a fun and fine card for Standard. I don't really blame Wizards here per se. Commander is an incredibly popular and profitable format, and Wizards should be designing cards with Commander in mind. But I will say, I'm not sure how you can design sets and cards that are both exciting for a format as big and as powerful as Commander, and safe for a format as small and lacking in power is Standard, especially when you're trying to do 6 sets a year with hundreds of cards in each set. Really though, the fatal flaw with Vivi's design was wording doing it in a way that worked with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. When Vivi was first previewed, I was actually pretty mid on the possibility of playing Vivi in the Prowess deck, just because Vivi's 3 mana, and if you killed it right away, it didn't really do anything. In a lot of ways, it looked like just another removal check card, and for better or worse, we've gotten a ton of those recently. Just look at Tifa Lockhart that's currently in Standard. If you don't got removal, it's probably going to murder you on turn 3 or turn 4. Making Vivi's ability in a way, though, that it could be transferred to other creatures with Agatha's Soul Cauldron completely changes the equation. If you're playing against a Cauldron deck, you might actually be helping your opponent by killing Vivi, because then you just let them turn a massive Marauding Mako or Fear of Missing Out into a Vivi. This takes Vivi's biggest weakness, which is dying without doing much of anything, and actually turns it into a strength, which is why we see the Izzet Cauldron deck being so dominant and so heavily played in Standard today. So yes, Vivi's prevalence is a problem, and yes, Vivi's design is a problem, and honestly, I would say an unforced error by Wizards. I don't think they needed to make Vivi like the most busted card of all time to sell the Final Fantasy set, considering they sold $200 million on the first day the set went on sale, and Vivi wasn't even spoiled at that point, so it seems like they kind of did all this for nothing in some sense as far as actually generating sales for the set. But speaking of money, the other big problem that Vivi's caused is increasing the price of Standard. My biggest concern with adding Universes Beyond to Standard had nothing to do with adding other IPs to Magic, but it was the fact that we'd have 6 Standard sets a year, with half of those sets being Universes Beyond sets that are already inflated just based on their MSRP price, and these sets so far haven't even been selling for MSRP, so adding Universes Beyond to Standard just made the format way more expensive. This had me worried that we would see the price of Standard snowball out of control because of this change, and we've already started to see that happen, and we're only a week past rotation. Well, Vivi is around $50. When you consider that Agatha's Soul Cauldron, also a 4 of in the deck, is around $65, and that's only 8 of the 75 cards that you need to build the actual Vivi Cauldron deck, the end price of that deck is around $800, which is absolutely insane for Standard, and if you look through the different lists of Izzet Cauldron that people have played, some of them even creep up over $850. This is a massive cost for a Standard deck. Just before rotation, I calculated the average price of a Standard deck and found it to be $326, so the Vivi Cauldron deck is more than double the average cost of a Standard deck before rotation, and as a result of the price of this deck, it's actually increased the average cost of playing Standard massively, with buying one of the top 12 decks in Standard right now costing an average of $446, which is a $120 jump from just a couple of months ago. Having a deck in Standard cost $800 isn't necessarily a big deal, but having the deck of Standard, the most played and arguably most powerful deck costing $800, is actually a pretty big concern. This has potential to cause some major pain in the future if Wizards ever decides that the Izzet Cauldron deck is actually too good and something from the deck needs to be banned. So I should say, this is very much not a call for a banning. We're a week after rotation, we only have early digital tournament results, way too early to talk about that, plus there isn't even a ban window for another 3 or 4 months anyway, so I'm not calling for anything to be banned, but I did want to point out that the price of Vivi and the Izzet Cauldron deck puts players in a pretty awkward position where if they want to play the best and most played deck in Standard, they already have to spend $800, which is just an abnormally high amount, but they're also going to have to worry in the back of their heads that this deck might actually be too good, and at some point down the road, Wizards might have to ban something from it, which would end up costing them a huge chunk of their $800 investment. Thankfully, the most expensive cards in Izzet Cauldron, which are Vivi and Agatha's Soul Cauldron themselves, see a lot of play in other formats, so if one of them did end up getting banned in Standard eventually, it wouldn't be a total loss for players, but still spending $800 on cards to build a Standard deck, knowing that with a single announcement on the mothership, all of those cards could turn into worthless pieces of cardboard, is a pretty scary proposition for a player. And this illuminates one of the biggest issues with the shift to 3 years of cards being legal in Standard. When Wizards announced the change, one of the big reasons they said is people wanted to keep playing with their cards and they didn't like when their cards rotated. Well, this does make some amount of sense. Magic's a super expensive game, as we've already been discussing. Printing cards like Vivi that are so pushed that they lead to conversations about whether they are even healthy for the game, whether they need to be banned, just diminishes players' confidence in buying those cards, and doubly so when the card that we're talking about is a super expensive card like Vivi. What good is changing how rotation works to let cards stay legal in Standard longer if you're just gonna print cards that are so busted you end up having to ban them after a few months anyway? And no, the solution here is not to avoid ever having to ban a card. So that's just not possible, especially in an era where every set has to be designed to be exciting in Commander while also being legal in Standard. And it's not avoiding taking any risks and not printing any powerful cards, because players like powerful and exciting cards, and they do help Wizards sell their sets. But what it is about is being wise about those risks. I'm not saying that Wizards has to toss all their design money into some stodgy old mutual fund, but I also would prefer that they don't YOLO all that money into some out-of-the-money options on Vivi, which seems to be kind of what they did with Vivi's design. So yes, we probably have a Vivi problem, or honestly, we have Vivi problems. Its prevalence in Standard is a problem, although honestly, out of all Vivi's problems, this is the one that concerns me less right now, just because we're only a week past rotation, and there's still plenty of time for the format to evolve and shift as we get new sets and move forward week to week. Plus, as I mentioned before, all of our results so far have come from digital tournaments, so let's not freak out too much about the meta until we get to the Spotlight series the end of the month and see what those numbers look like. Vivi's price and the price of the deck that it goes in is also a problem, and honestly, it's hard for me to see how this problem solves itself. Even if Vivi's metagame percentage in Standard declines, the card's still super busted and super popular in Commander, so I imagine that it would remain incredibly expensive even if it somehow became less of a Standard staple. Most of all, Vivi's design is a problem, and really, for me, this is the most concerning of problems. Much like last year's design disaster, Nadu Winged Wisdom, which also came about because of last-minute changes trying to make the card more exciting for Commander players with seemingly little regard for good design or playtesting practices. With the endless chase to make cards more powerful, more exciting, more profitable, to give them less safety valves, while also having to juggle making one set and one card that's safe and fun for Standard, while also somehow exciting for a very different Commander format, means that VVs are likely to keep happening, and that's kind of worrying because we already have a VV problem. Looking for even more magic, we can find our Standard land destruction deck here, or maybe the video where we went through the greatest plays in the history of Magic the Gathering.